Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we're going to chat a little bit about cycle syncing.
Yeah. So cycle syncing, mainly your workouts on my end, at least, because I know absolutely nothing about the flip side of it. You know what, like seed cycling or whatever it is. Have you heard of
Oh, I've
that?
never, no, I haven't.
There's literally like a whole camp of human beings that I guess it's probably women, but but human beings that are that eat like different kinds of seeds during different phases of their cycle because of the nutrients that are in each. I think that's what it is.
Oh my
So we're not going to be
gosh.
talking about that.
No, wow. Okay.
That's just completely out of my wheelhouse of research and anything like that. But I have heard a lot of evidence-based people in the industry kind of like dog on it. So like I'll just leave it at that. Like I'm not touching it.
Yeah, that seems like a lot of work.
Yeah, a lot of effort. I mean, if you already track your cycles super diligently and you want like certain nutrients and certain time frames, that's great. But I'm just not here for that level of minuscule detail.
No, no. So, I mean, I would assume if you clicked on this episode, you know what cycle syncing is,
Yeah.
or you have an idea of it. But I guess just to kind of define it, very similar to what Marissa was just describing, it's just psyching or like syncing your syncing your workouts, exercise around your menstrual cycle. So the idea is just trying to align things with like your hormone fluctuations that just kind of occur throughout your menstrual cycle. And this is trying to optimize like your physical and mental well-being.
Yeah. And I think a big part of it is like how you are supposed to quote unquote feel during each phase of your cycle and making
Hmm.
each part of your cycle easier to train with.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of different, I'm assuming, styles of this because I've heard the extremes of when you are in certain phases, you like only walk and do yoga, and in other phases, you
Hmm.
lift hard and heavy. But we actually have a podcast episode way, way back. I think it's episode like 22 or something like that, if I had to guess. That number might be wrong, but it's early and you'd have to scroll back a lot. But you can search it Barbell Lifestyle Podcast with Kelly McNulty. And we
Hmm.
discussed a lot about that whole topic of how do we really kind of get the most out of training with a menstrual cycle versus with contraceptives, hormonal contraceptives, which was really a really, really great topic. She's a top researcher in that line of work. But I think it's kind of gotten popularized lately of like, well, you should match it all up because you're a woman and you're different. So you need to make sure that you're paying attention to that. And there are elements of truth to everything, is what I always like to say. Everything that gets popular out there, there are elements of truth to it. Otherwise, it would just be stomped on and squashed. But it's the elements of truth that are really exaggerated that typically kind of take it a step too far in a lot of cases if you just take things really literally or you're just trying to follow some plan that some guru said would be best for you. And especially when they say, cycle sync your workouts for the best fat loss or to look like me or to get
Hmm.
a certain result, that's really where you're probably being misled.
Yeah, yeah. We can go down a deep rabbit hole with that. But I think it's important to kind of talk about the different stages of your
Yeah.
cycle.
Yeah.
So this is on the normal 28-day cycle, like an average. Some are more, some are less, but typically the first phase is the menstrual phase. So this is when you're shedding of the uterine lining. And so typically your hormones are a little bit lower. And so most people have low energy, you're potentially really fatigued. And I was also just thinking about this. There are, I guess, reels now on Instagram with like women like walking to the gym during different phases of their cycle and like how
Yeah.
they show up and their energy. But yeah, so that just made me think of that. But and that's typically day 1 through 5. And then
Yeah.
day 6 through 14 is your follicular phase. So this is typically a rise in estrogen leading up to ovulation. And most people have increased energy. They have in like a improvement in mood, and then you're in your ovulation phase, and this is typically anywhere from day 15 to 17. And this is when your body releases an egg and your peak estrogen and testosterone levels. So typically during this phase, a lot of women have high energy. And this is typically when your strength is really high and your endurance is really high. And then you're in your luteal phase, which is day 18 to 28. And this is when your progesterone increases and you have potential PMS symptoms. So you have a decrease in energy and an increased need for rest. And so I like to just put like a little asterisk and just say this is generally speaking, and this is not what every woman experiences during their cycle.
Yeah. And I'll add in a little piece here. The PMS section is typically like those last few days leading up to day 28. And estrogen and progesterone have peaked at this point, and then they both come crashing down. And that crash is typically what's ensuing most of these PMS-like symptoms, or at least they're coinciding with the symptoms that you have, is this big high slope downward spike in your hormones. And then it goes back to flatlining and the cycle repeats. So typically when we talk about the cycle, we're talking about two main hormones that are fluctuating, estrogen and progesterone. However, there's lots of other hormones that fluctuate throughout the cycle as well. We just typically mark the cycle with those two. And so estrogen, I feel like it just gets this bad rep from like bodybuilders being like, estrogen gives you man boobs. But like, ultimately, estrogen for women is like our equivalent to male testosterone. Like it gives us strength, endurance, power, energy. The presence of estrogen fluctuating naturally in our body is what helps keep our bone density high as well. And so it's protective of muscle, of bone density. And when it's high, that's when we feel really good. Like the end of that follicular phase into ovulation, that's when we're really feeling our best typically if we're paying attention in the gym. And that's a really great time to go for PRs and things like that. And then when they are either crashing, when estrogen's either crashing or just flatline and low, we don't feel typically the best in the gym. And then progesterone raising up and crashing in that luteal phase definitely plays another role in the fatigue and the energy that we feel. So this is where that cycle syncing comes from, is knowing the facts about how these hormones fluctuate and how correlationally we typically tend to feel. But it's really critical. I mean, if you listen to that episode that I referenced, like big takeaway from it all, big spoiler alert, is like track your cycle and pay attention to how you feel in each portion of your menstrual cycle, because it can really, really vary for a lot of women, especially if you don't have the greatest handle on consistent training, nutrition, good sleep, eating a really nutrient dense diet. This is when sometimes having different deficiencies and just having a high stress on your body can exacerbate symptoms sometimes. Or if you have all those things going really well for you, sometimes your symptoms can be dampened. I've experienced both ends of that. And so it's really important that this is all very individual, which is where blanket recommendations for cycle syncing don't always line up. And so while these things might be true, is it wise to basically stop training for the final 14 days of your cycle because of what cycle syncing says to do? Probably not. And I understand that not all cycle syncing is that extreme, but just for sake of example, there are gurus out there that have suggested, okay, luteal phase, going through PMS, you're feeling X, Y, and Z way, your body's more prone to injury. You need to eat more and you need to stop training. Well, for the average person off the street, eat more and stop training means go back to some old lifestyle habits that you were actually trying to avoid going back to. And what they really mean is maybe you increase by 100 or 200 calories per day and you decrease the intensity of your workouts, but you still stay active. And so I think there's just so much nuance in there that's missed from short 6-second reels on Instagram trying to explain this complicated concept.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And so everyone has like the different, okay, here's how you modify for this phase. Here's how you modify for this. This is how you modify for this. And that's a lot to keep track of every
Yeah.
single week, where it's like, oh, okay, this week I am doing uh Pilates and yoga. This week I'm prioritizing PRs and strength training. And so to just kind of go back and forth between all these different types of activities would be a lot to keep track of.
Yeah.
And I don't really, and like you were saying before, if we don't have a very strong foundation to begin with, this is not going to make a big difference at all
Yeah.
in the results that you're seeing. And so we talk about this all the time. And I think Jordan Syatt said something about this the other day. He did a reel, ironically, right? Where he's like, I'm just so fed up with the fitness industry. And he's like, you scroll and it's like, don't do cardio. Cardio's the devil. Like, it's going to kill you. And then there's also people that are like, run marathons with me. And then it's like, don't eat oatmeal for breakfast. You should eat. And it's like, it's so hard. It's so hard to figure out like what you should or shouldn't be doing. And the thing that you and I preach at the end of the day is like, we need healthy habits that we can do all the time and like really, really build that foundation. If you are someone who does have very extreme like symptoms when you're on your cycle, this might be beneficial for you.
Yeah.
But for the majority of the population that are just trying to increase their protein intake or trying to get into the gym a few days a week, like this is really not it.
Yeah. Well, what I will say too, actually, what you made me think of with that is the only way that you can really know if cycle syncing anything will benefit you is if you have some foundational habits down. Because if you're eating like trash and it fluctuates all the time and you're kind of on and off with your training, then you're probably going to have horrible PMS symptoms, bad cycles. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of evidence to show that a lot of just severity of the hormone fluctuations and the bloating that we feel and the exhaustion that we feel. Like, imagine if we're also not sleeping and eating like trash while that's going on. Like, we're just going to feel 10 times worse. And so, and that might sound kind of harsh, but I think it's really important that you have a good baseline of your training, maybe 3, 4 something times a week. You are eating nutrient dense foods and a well balanced diet like 80% of the time. And then if you notice that it might benefit you to scale back a little bit in times of PMS with your cycle, like for example, the reason I brought this topic up today was like, I'm on my period right now and I feel like absolute trash because it's day 1 of my cycle. And I was like, I want to train today, but I also really don't want to train. And my body feels like this and that. And so it's like, for me, it's that permission of it's day 1. You don't have any workouts left to do. If you want to go for a long walk or a short bike ride in the garage, great. But like, let's not super exert ourselves today because it's probably not going to help. And there's no reason to, and it's really not going to feel good. Versus like, yeah, just someone who's kind of not really in touch with the regularity of it all. Because if you're training, all throughout the month, trying to hit the same workouts over and over again, and you notice fluctuations throughout that month of how you're feeling, when you're feeling strong, when you're feeling weak, then you can start to like really associate that and say, okay, well, maybe I can kind of just give myself the permission that I need to not go balls to the wall when I'm in the middle of my cycle or PMS, but I can really push it when I'm just feeling good. And I think auto regulation is the word that comes to mind for me. Of with your training, I mean, we want to just kind of listen to our body, what it's telling us any given day. And I think tracking our cycle is a good way to kind of like bolster that understanding of like, I'm not feeling good today, rather than beating myself up for it. Oh, let me look at my cycle tracking app. Oh, interesting. I'm, right in that crash of hormones and that PMS time. That explains a lot. Okay, let me give myself some grace here, because what we're trying to avoid is being so down on ourselves from having a bad workout that we just throw the towel in and we give up on something or kind of go into that all or nothing spiral. So that's kind of what the utility of it is, in my opinion.
Yeah, but I think that you made a really, really good point there where you go into the gym You have your prescribed workout. You
Yeah.
try to do the workout.
Yeah.
If it's not going well, it's, what could be some factors? What
Right.
was my pre-workout nutrition meal? What was my sleep look like the day or two before? Like, what's been going on? Like, I'm, day one of my cycle. Well, that explains a lot. Rather than
Yeah.
first looking at your cycle tracker, going into the gym, and then being like, oh, I am supposed to be really weak today. I'm supposed to feel really fatigued, because it's like you're setting yourself up for failure. You get into your head and you like psych yourself out. So I think it's really, really important that it's not at the forefront, and it's something that you just take into consideration when you're looking at things. I don't think it should be, oh, well, I'm going into the gym today and this is what's going to happen based on where I'm at in my cycle.
Yeah. You will 100% placebo your way into a shitty workout.
Yeah.
It will
um,
happen.
yeah. So that's kind of my take on cycle syncing. Is I do think that there are some potential benefits, but it has to be if everything else is already kind of there as far as your
Yeah.
foundation. The other thing I do think that there is a benefit to it is just the idea of like tracking your cycle.
Oh,
So because I remember a time that I didn't do this, like I was just on the pill. I just, whatever, just like, oh, I'm on my sugar pills this week. And like, okay, like I just didn't really pay attention to it. And I remember I'd like early on in my coaching career, I had some clients who would be like, oh, yeah, it's my ovulation week. Like, I tend to see a spike in my weight. And I was like, okay. Like, so we see a change in your PMS cycle. And we also see a weight spike with ovulate, and I was like, this is kind of silly. I just kind of felt like they were giving themselves excuses. And then I started tracking my cycle. And lo and behold, I'm like, wow, I do actually see an increase in my weight as well.
yeah.
So I do think that there are a lot of benefits, because it really does help you become a lot more in tune with your body and like how you feel in particular weeks, particular phases. And it just gives you, I feel like you just get to know your body a little bit better. And I think that that's really, really important. And that could give you, like some insight into how to adjust your routine. And maybe you do need a little bit of additional rest, or a little bit of extra sleep, being flexible in workouts. But I just don't think that it should be the end all be all in
Yeah.
how you're working out.
Definitely not. Yeah. And you brought up something really important when you said you were on the pill at that point in time in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Almost none of this applies with hormonal contraceptives because when you're taking the pill, you have a completely different hormonal profile across the month compared to a natural cycle. So probably should have remembered to put this disclaimer at the beginning, but this is for a naturally menstruating person, because with the pill, you're taking exogenous hormones evenly throughout the month that blunt your natural production and keep you at basically what your hormones are days 1 through 5 when you're bleeding at flat line, baseline. Like just imagine a straight line at the bottom of a graph. That's where estrogen and progesterone are when you're bleeding, and also when you're on a hormonal contraceptive. And so that's like 21 of 28 days. And then the other 7 that you take the kind of placebo pill, the hormones basically like try to start spiking up a little bit, but they don't really go that far. And then when you start taking the pill again, they just crash back down. And so the bleed in a oral contraceptive cycle is a withdrawal bleed, and it's actually not, ovulating and a normal cycle. It's kind of just like a side effect of getting off the pill for those days. So that, and then, there's IUDs and there's the implant and all these things. They all function differently, but they do all blunt the hormones to a decent degree where it's a little bit different. You kind of have to pay attention differently, and it's not necessarily going to be as predictable as the normal healthy menstrual cycle that we're describing here. And so big asterisk of like, you can still track things, and I assume that if you're taking a pill every day, you know where you're at in that cycle. But it's just a little bit different with training, which I think also can confuse women because a lot of women don't know that. They literally think they're on a regular cycle when they're taking the pill. And then they see all the cycle syncing on Instagram, and here's how to do this and this and this. And then they start adding variables to their training and their routines that are basically completely unnecessary because they're just going to be at an even spot all throughout the month.
Yeah. Yeah. And so thinking about it from a training standpoint too, like we touched on this, but if you have a program, a training program, but you are changing things up every single week, it's going to be very, very difficult to progress. It's going to be very difficult to build strength and see progress. And I would almost argue that it's going to hold you back from the progress that you want to see. Because you're not going to be able to really progress a whole lot if you're doing Pilates one week and then resting another week and then going for PRs and then doing moderate strength training. Like you're just not really gonna see progress. So actually the next podcast that we're gonna record is the best type of workouts that you should be doing. And so I think that'll be a really fun one to record after this one.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think just the takeaway here is if you're a normally menstruating woman, I would just go into the gym with the intent to follow your program. Try your best to just stick with the days per week, the split that you're on as it's programmed for you. And obviously, if you just are so beat up and you're having these awful symptoms and you need to skip a day at the gym and you're like, oh, interesting, I'm PMSing today, or I just started my cycle. Well, give yourself some grace and allow that information to kind of give you that peace of mind of like, okay, this would be expected. Let me just wipe the slate clean and try to get back into it tomorrow or the day after. And use the information, the tracking, the cycle knowledge to bolster the information that you have after the fact, retroactively.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, guys, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. You can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christina and Fit, and Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. Thank you guys so much for listening and hope to see you back next week.